freeze, you'll see I have a ton of different Python libraries installed on my machine. A virtual environment starts from scratch and says we're only going to have certain of these installed in this virtual environment based on a file. You just put in all of the dependencies or libraries you want to use for that project. That's really nice because then if I share my project with 10 other people, they all just need to have this one file called requirements.txt that I'll show you soon, and it will work on all of our machines. One of the beauties of Python is that if I have Python code that works on my machine, it is basically 99.99% guaranteed to also work on your machine because of this thing called a virtual environment. So to make this directory into a virtual environment, I type virtual end period. It sets up kind of a basic Python setup. And now if I list what's in this directory, I have a couple of folders. If I do source bin activate, that just enters me into the virtual environment. So I'm saying now I'm only going to be using the Python libraries that have been installed in this virtual environment. So if I again run pip freeze, which says show me all the Python libraries I have none. Now I'm going to install the Flask framework, which I just say pip install Flask. It installs it just into this virtual environment. If I again run pip freeze, it now shows me I have a couple of things installed, one of them being Flask version 0.11.1. Now I mentioned that requirements.txt file, which specifies everything somebody needs to run your code. This part's not super important. Just going over your head, just know that there's a way to specify that I just want these files to be on somebody's machine. All I do is take the output of that command of what I have and send it to a file called requirements.txt. Now anybody else who you had this virtualized and had this file, they would just need to run pip-r install and requirements.txt, and it would install all of those files for them. Again, that's all stuff you can look up online, but the main idea is that now I have a folder that has Flask installed inside of it. So now into the actual important stuff, the back-end code that generates a website. The installing stuff can always be on your own. It usually takes a while the first time, don't get frustrated, but the coding part is hopefully, in the Flask, the most painless part. If I open a new file called app.py, and I paste this code from Flask's website into it.
David, can you make the font a bit bigger?
Yes, I can. All right, a little bigger. Okay, so again, this is the same code I went over before that just returns a string. If from the terminal, I'll actually open it in a separate pane so I can see the code as I'm running it. If I run Python in the name of that file, so just like you would run any other Python file, you type Python in a terminal, you type the name of your file, and it runs. Actually, first I'm going to have to source bin activate again, then python app.py. It now says running on, and then it gives me this weird little thing, but you should recognize the http://. That's usually what you see at the beginning of a URL when you go to any other web page, and that's because that actually is a web page. 127.0.0.1 is an IP address. An IP address is kind of the fingerprint of a specific machine in the world, but that one, it will show up the same for all of us, because 127.0.0.1 specifically means this computer that you ran this Python file on. So for me, none of you can access that file unless I give you access, but it's called localhost. So it means on my computer on port 5000, don't worry about ports for right now, this website is running. So if I just copy that where it says it's running and paste it into my browser, copy, come over here and paste, I see the string hello world, which is what I had that function return. What I'm going to talk about this little :5000 for a little bit. My computer and any computer can host lots and lots of websites at once, and there's lots of different kind of networking things computers can do. So to make this easy, we invented something called ports, so that your computer can host a website. Each different port can do a different networking thing. You have thousands and thousands of them on any computer. So for example, I'm hosting this on port 5000. I could not host another website on port 5000 But I could host another website on port 5001, 5002, anything up. I think it goes up to like 16,000, something like that. There are a lot of ports. And this is always happening. The web runs on port 80 and 443, which you may have never noticed. But if you go to google.com, you type google.com:80, the 80 disappears because in the normal web, it's like you're always typing :80 after a domain because every web server on the planet is taught to listen on port 80. So when you type in a domain name into Chrome or any browser, it just assumes if you didn't put a port, you're going on port 80. And if you type in HTTPS instead of HTTP, then it goes to port 443. But the internet is all based around port 80, so when you're testing, you can test on any of 16,000 ports, but don't test on port 80 or 443. Basically, anything else, usually above 5,000 is a safe bet. You won't run into any problems. There are some other reserve ports, but chances are you'll never run into them. And if you do, it's usually an easy fix. So over on running Flask, you can see it has some kind of output. It shows me I got a GET request from localhost, and then it also got something called favicon.ico. It's just a little icon on the site, but this will show every time somebody goes to your site and sends a different request, it'll log another GET request. So that GET request is because in my browser, Google Chrome is making a request to server localhost, which comes to my computer and says, hey, I need access for the files running on port 5000. This process controls port 5000, so it receives this GET request and it says, all right, I know what to do. From that function, I'm going to return back the string, hello world. So it's always, anytime you enter on a browser, you're making a request. A lot of pages make a lot of requests you may not even realize, but requests are constantly happening behind the scenes in your browser, and you just see the data, which is great for the user. You don't have to worry about how all that happens, but if you're designing the site, you do. So I can do, say I wanted to make another endpoint. So an endpoint is just a URL somebody can go to and get back a site or data. Say I want them to be able to go to /data and have it display some data from the site. In Flask, that's as easy as creating another function. So I'll create function data. It doesn't matter what you call it. And we have to say where should, or remember our server is a function. They have to first take in a URL. So we have to say for which URL do we want function data to run on. Over here, what did I say? I said /data. So when they go to /data, have it run this function and return whatever function data returns. So if I, again, return a string, that'll be easy for now. I restart my server, invalid syntax. I restart it, I come back to data, and it returns the string A. But that's not very interesting. I want to return something called JSON. So JSON is just a string, but it's kind of a community-accepted string in the programming world for when you want code that is written in Python to be sent over to code that's written in JavaScript, and then sent to code that's written in Ruby, and sent to all these different languages. We kind of made a default way we would structure our data in a string so that all these different languages could interpret it very easily and parse it into one of its own kind of native data structures. So like in JavaScript, there's something called an associative array, which is very, very similar to in Python, something called a dictionary, which is very, very similar to all these different languages have the same things. They all have arrays, they all have dictionaries, but they're represented in different ways in those languages. JSON is just kind of a standard language where you say that every language basically on the planet knows how to turn into its own special things that it knows and loves. So in Python, JSON is most closely related to a dictionary. If I wanted to make a dictionary, I would make a new variable. I'll just call it D, and you use these curly braces. Inside of those curly braces, you use key value pairs, so it's easiest if I just write one out. All right, key 1 goes to value 5, and hello as a key goes to string world. So if you're familiar with arrays, a lot of times arrays are based on an index. So arrays have a 0th item, a first item, a second item, all the way up through however long the array is. Dictionaries aren't ordered like that. Dictionaries instead are ordered by their keys. So instead of saying if D was an array and you wanted the first element, you would do D of 0. But instead, we don't want an ordered element, we want something with key 1 or hello. So instead of putting a number in the brackets, we put key 1. So in this case, D of key 1 would have value 5. D of hello would have value 1. That's kind of a syntactical thing in Python. I'm trying to keep this language agnostic, so in any other language, there may be a different way. Like in Ruby, it's a slightly different syntax for getting something out of their version of a dictionary. But there's always a way to have, every language has some sort of data structure that's basically exactly like this, that works in a very similar way. In Flask, we now want to convert this dictionary into JSON and then return it to the server so that in the browser, when they go to URL/data, they're just going to get the dictionary values of key15 and hello world printed out to their screen. So Flask has a lot of libraries. If you haven't seen Python syntax for including things from a library, the syntax of from Flask, import Flask means there's a file named flask.py or module that has a class or function named Flask in it that we're going to be using. Flask has a lot of super handy functions that are found on Flask's website. It has really great docs if you ever want to just run through it quickly. Another one of them is called JSONify, which, as you would kind of expect, creates JSON values. So in this data function, instead of just returning a string now, I'm going to return JSONify ** D. So it's a really ugly syntax. It's one of the only really ugly things in Python. But what this says at a high level, if I spell it right, JSONify is take this dictionary D, convert it into JSON, and then return it to the browser that requested this URL. So now, if I restart the server, and I come over here, and I go to /data, it now has in a little syntax, you can see it's actually returning data. So this is different. Most times, pretty much every other time, you've probably gone to a browser and typed in something, you've gotten back an HTML web page. HTML is actually kind of similar to JSON. They're both just markup languages. But this is a different kind called JSON. So this is really useful if you're a program that's just wanting to go and say, hey, what are the top high scores for my program? You just want to get data back so that you can add that data to your site really quickly, because if you're just programmatically asking what is the top high score, you don't necessarily need HTML and the full display, because that display is never going to be put on your site. That was a very confusing explanation. But basically, JSON is a way to present data on the screen that's not HTML. HTML being every other web page you've seen before. The last kind of Flask function I'm going to go over is how to actually return an HTML document. So, as some of you may know, in front end, most of the time that you spend writing your code is spent on writing HTML. It's kind of a language that says, hey, I want a header on the page and then 3 paragraphs. And in Flask, you can also return HTML, and that's probably one of the most common things you can actually return. If you have HTML pages with CSS and JavaScript, all of that can be returned from one of these functions. So the first thing I am going to do is create a HTML page. So I'm going to make a templates directory. That's something that Flask requires you to do, not important for right now. I'm going to open a file called index.html. HTML is something you guys can all learn on your own if you don't already know it. There's no real program, there's no if statements, there's no for loops. Anything that's kind of intimidating or hard to learn when you're going through normal programming isn't found in HTML. It's just text. And you just kind of put different tags around text to have it display differently. Like you would put a different tag around a header that you want to be really big, then versus a paragraph, then versus a link, then versus an image. And all of those you can kind of look up on your own. And it's a very beginner-friendly language that if you kind of learn slowly over time, I'm confident that all of you could learn it on your own, so I'm not going to spend too much time. But to create a quick version, I'm going to say I am making a document that is an HTML document. These things in brackets are called tags. So I'm going to make you always start with this set of tags. You have a head, a body inside of HTML tags. Inside of body is anything that's displayed on the page. So if in here I put a header, which is an H1 tag, big text, and a paragraph that says smaller text. This is now a full HTML document that'll have a really big, bold, big text and smaller text in a paragraph. To show you just opening that without using Flask, this is something you can all do if you just have an HTML file. If you just double click it, it will automatically open in the browser with what that HTML is. But if you're using Flask, there's something called templating I'll get into shortly that makes HTML a lot more fun, which is why you don't just do this and you use Flask, because you can inject variables in your HTML, which I will show next. So back inside of Flask, we're going to have a third function. This one will be when they type in HTML, we're going to have it return the index.html file. So we're going to say def, I'll just call it home. We're going to return in a string index.html. And the last thing we have to do is wrap this in a function. So Flask has another function, just like JSONify, that we can import that will make an HTML file and actually get the text from the HTML file on your server and then send that to the user. And it's called render template. It's a rather long name, but all you do is you take the name of your file and put it as the only argument to render template. Now when I reload the 127.001 page and go to /HTML, I see that same HTML page is displayed back here. This is really cool, and you can make a lot of websites just with what I've shown so far. Kind of the big ideas that are important to take away from this Flask file so far are that every different page you want to display to a user needs its own routing function. Every language that you're going to use, Ruby on Rails, mean stack, so the JavaScript, whatever framework you're using on your backend, you're going to have something called routing. Even some front-end frameworks have something called routing now. Where they're saying, based on what URL they type, what data am I going to return to them? You can return lots of different things. Here we're returning an actual HTML file that gets compiled by Flask for you. Here we're returning data in something called JSON. You don't need to focus on JSON right now. If you get into web development in the future, JSON is super, super nice and will make your life a lot easier. But if you're just kind of starting on web development, it's not super important to focus on that right now. And then the simplest version, the start one, is just returning a string. So that's just one line, no Flask necessary. It's just saying somebody requests to this server for URL /, and the server just says, all I have to return is this string. And the browser knows what to do with that, thankfully. So in index.html, you could add lots of JavaScript, CSS, have it do all kinds of things like you do in your front end. Front ends are very, very powerful now. But the last thing I'm going to show is that why this is actually more powerful than just a normal HTML file. So remember I said a normal HTML file doesn't have variables, it doesn't have for loops, it doesn't have any of those scary things. Flask actually, and a lot of other things, actually use the same templating language called Jinja 2, which gives HTML the power to do for loops and if statements and have variables inside of them. So if you don't want to use them, you never need to use variables in HTML, but I will show you what they look like right now. So in render template.html, any additional arguments you send it, so if I send it name equals Pierce, because he left, now this index.html will have a variable that I can use called name. If I open up that index, oops, it's in templates, vi templates index.html. Now anywhere on this page, I'm just going to add another paragraph, and I'm going to put this variable name. And the way to specify in HTML that it is a variable and that you didn't actually want to type the text name is to put two curly braces around either side. So again, this is going to be the same. Your HTML files are templated. You can use the exact same HTML whether you're using Ruby on Rails. MeanStack's a little different sometimes. Django, Flask, tons and tons of different libraries will let you use this exact same templating language, which is super, super nice. So if I now restart the server and go to this page, there's now a new paragraph under there that does not say curly brace, name, curly brace. It now says Pierce, because Flask, before it returns that data from our server, which in this case is my laptop, to the client, being Google Chrome, that render template function first says, hey, there's this HTML file, but I have these additional variables. I'm going to look through that HTML file. Anytime I see something inside curly braces, I'm going to check if I have a variable that I could replace that with. If it can, then it does. If it can't, then it just leaves it as 2 curly braces. And you can pass all different kinds of variables. So over here, you can do if statements. If statements have a syntax like this. You can do like if name equals Pierce, and then have some HTML else. And if, I'm not going to go through this, but this would just be an example. Any HTML you put in between here would only be rendered if the variable name equals Pierce. Otherwise, whatever you put between here would be rendered. A really common example of this is, say you guys have a website that has login and logout, and you have a top little bar on your website that you want a button to say either log in if they are logged out, or log out if they're logged in. You just put one of these little if statements, and you pass in a variable if they're logged in or not. You say if they're logged in, have it say log out. If they're logged out, have it say log in. And just by running that, you can save tons and tons of time. Another really common use case is for loops. So a lot of times, I'll show an example of this in another project. But this templating saves you potentially thousands and thousands of lines of code. So if I go into another project I've worked on, and I go into this templated HTML page, this is going to be rather big. Let me search for a for loop. Let me search. One second. It's down here. Yeah. So here is a for loop where I say, and again, this is Django, so it's a different language, but as I said, they all use the same templating language. I say for each item in event.active items, so that's something in my database. Then I have a bunch of HTML code where instead of putting in like the title of each item I want to put on my page, I can use the variable item. So I can just say like item.image URL, and in my database there will be an item with an image URL that it's just a URL for a specific picture for that item. You don't need to understand this code, but what this code is this for loop is maybe about 30 lines long. And on the actual website, I think in this database, event.active items is just an array of like 60 different items I had for this website. So this same code will be applied to all 60 of those items, and they'll all be added to my page one by one, meaning those, instead of having 60 times 30 lines of code, I now just have one set of 30 lines of code with a little for loop wrapped around either end, saying, for everything in my database, write this code. This makes life much, much easier because you don't have to do things like, it's really annoying if you have a website and you have 60 items, each with a picture, or description, and name, and a client just sends you, they'll send you a new list every morning and say, hey, I have 2 more items for you to add. And you don't want to have to manually go into the HTML, copy and paste a couple times. Then if they say, hey, could you actually move the title over a couple pixels? Then you're going to have to go through all 60 instances in your code and hope you don't make typos as you change all 60 of those things to have your code moved over. Here, everything's just one block of code in a for loop. Templating is really, really cool and really powerful, but that's all I'm going to say about it for right now. I guess I'll just kind of talk about, I'll reopen that Flask file just to have, I'll talk about it a bit more. But this whole Flask file is maybe 20 lines of code. It has 3 different web pages that return 3 different kinds of data. The reason I chose Flask is because it's so short in its lines of code count to be able to do some really powerful things. Actually, Flask source code as a framework is only about, I think it's 2,000 lines long, and it's not very difficult. Python, if you guys have Python experience and are interested in web development, it actually is a really good exercise, I think, to read through something like Flask source code, because you'll see that these fairly seemingly magical complex things like JSONify and render template are actually like 4-line Python functions that are they're totally open source. You can just go download the code. And that's true of a lot of different languages and frameworks. But there are lots of other languages that are better at certain things. So I personally use either Django or Ruby on Rails for most of my projects. To do this in Django would probably be closer to 90 to 120, somewhere in their lines of code. It's a lot more lines of code. It's more difficult to do simple things like this, but it's much more powerful. This is true of Ruby on Rails as well. Doing really complex database things is usually 1 or 2 lines, where in Flask you actually have to write SQL code. A lot of you probably know SQL if you've taken a database course or looked at databases at all. It's an awful language that's just truly terrible and nobody should ever have to write anymore. But in something like Django or Ruby on Rails, it handles all the database stuff for you. And if you have a class of items, you can just say like, hey, give me all the items. You just say items.objects.all. You have all the items. And filtering you can also do in 1 line to only get items that had a start date before a certain point. So there are certain frameworks that are better used for different things. If you want to do something with lots of databases, tons of items, you're probably going to want to go towards MeanStack. So MeanStack is with Node.js. Node.js is the backend if you haven't heard of it. Django, Ruby on Rails are probably kind of the dominant options in the web development world today. Those probably encompass 95% of websites. Also, Facebook uses PHP still. PHP is a very real, still used thing. WordPress uses PHP. I recommend never learning PHP if you don't need to. It's a lot uglier and would take probably 300 lines to do this. But it is a language out there that is very marketable as far as jobs go. But Flask has no database control. If you want to use a database in Flask, it's just like using a database in normal Python. But it's really quick for doing things just like giving the user data or making really simple websites, especially if you want to use this templating feature, or just if you want to make, a lot of times you work on something called an API, which is something programmable interface. Who knows what's an API? Application programming interface, is that what it is? Okay. So an API is a really common kind of website where you only return data. So you don't return HTML pages at all. So for example, if you are Facebook or any company, they have lots of APIs because they want people to use their data. So you don't have to go to, if I want to see all of the friends of myself on Facebook, I don't have to write code that goes to facebook.com in the browser, simulates the browser, and then goes and finds the friends page and searches through all my friends. I can just go to Facebook, and Facebook has some APIs available to the public where I can say, here's my login information, find all of my friends. And then it will just return in that JSON kind of list. It will say friend 1, their name, friend 2, their name. And it may contain a little bit more information. It may have their email, birthday, things like that. But that's one really, really popular use of JSON, is to return data. Even if you don't end up writing your own APIs, it can be very, very useful to at least know how to use other people's APIs. Because there's none of us, even if all of us together decided to try and write all of the code that Facebook has right now, or Google or Twitter, we could not in our lifetimes. It's just not possible for a group of 30, 40 people. So we take the code expertise that they've gone through thousands and thousands and millions of tests on, and we say, hey, that code you wrote is really, really awesome. Let's borrow some of your data. So we don't need to see their code. All we need to do is ask them, just like in a normal browser, you're asking the server for a web page. we're asking Facebook servers or Google servers or whoever has the API, hey, can we get some of your data? Because that would be really useful to use in our site. Reuse of code is super popular. You guys have probably noticed Gmail, Facebook, GitHub, those kind of logins are on basically every site in existence now, because all of those websites have given 2 or 3 line implementations to include those things in your site. And if they're longer lines, it's copy and pastable. So sites have made it really easy. They want you, Facebook wants you to use Facebook login and Facebook data on your website. So these companies have spent hours and hours and millions of dollars not building the website that people go to and post statuses on, but one where just a website where you can go and get data back from them. That data is super useful. If you ever go to hackathons, the majority of projects are built on APIs, and they're really good. Hackathons, I do recommend. It's a great experience if you want to practice using an API, especially if you've never used one. A lot of hackathon projects will be, IBM, their Watson has a really cool API where you send it a file and it gives you back text from that file. That was a project at Irish Hacks, it was really cool. So they made an HTML file where somebody could upload a file to it. They sent that file in a request to IBM Watson. IBM Watson's API sent back JSON data saying, here's all the text inside of that file you uploaded. And then they took that JSON results and made it into their own web page. And yeah, APIs are everywhere. And all they are is a function like this. An API is just a set of functions that returns data, not a web page. To show you a quick example, if I'm on the HTML page and I want to get the values from data, data is an API that I can call. So I am going to have to, I don't want to do it in vanilla JavaScript, so I'm going to go cdn.js jQuery, not library. jQuery is a very popular JavaScript library if you haven't seen it. It's not used a ton anymore, but it is. It's not hipster, but it's still very powerful and used all the time. So I'm going to go into my index.html file and just at the bottom of body include jQuery. Just like in Python before I showed you, you can include Flask files. So I was including JSONify, render template from Flask before. In HTML, you include something by using either a script or a link tag, script for JavaScript files, link for CSS files. Just saying include jQuery in my site. If I now restart the server and go to that HTML page, I am gonna hope I can make this big enough for everyone to see. So in your browser, you may not know this, but you have a JavaScript console where you can just type JavaScript. So in this console, if I type alert hello, the page will display a little alert box that says hello to me. You used to see those alert boxes all the time on websites. You don't see them as much anymore because they don't look great. But they're one line of JavaScript and are really useful for debugging. But if I want to get the JSON results from my /data page, all I do is I do $, which means using jQuery, .get JSON, and the first argument is the URL you want to get JSON for. So the API endpoint is the fancy term for which URL you're getting data from. I'm going to go /data. The second argument is a function that takes in as an argument the JSON that is received from that URL. If you don't know JavaScript, this is a really confusing syntax. It takes a long time to understand why you have functions as parameter arguments. Just kind of go with it for a few years and then eventually you'll figure out what it is. But inside this function, I now have a variable called result that is the output from the JSON from this /data page. I'm just going to say console.log result. What this line is doing is saying, first part, use jQuery, get JSON from the URL /data, and then have a function that takes in the output of the JSON from /data, and inside that function just print what that result is. So along the line, that all it's going to do is print to the console the value it gets back from /data. I do that, and it prints back an object with key hello value world and key t1 value 5. which is the data we return from slash data. And a lot of APIs are used very similarly to this. In the Facebook world and kind of the social media age, it's slightly complicated by the fact that a lot of times you need a login to see data. They don't want people, because otherwise, if I put this request in a for loop, I could have it run as fast as this browser will allow. It just keeps peppering my server with data. My computer would probably crash pretty quick. Likewise, Facebook, those big companies also don't want people hitting their servers with millions of requests per minute. So they make you have a login, that way they can track how many requests you're sending per minute, hour, second, whatever it is. And if you start sending too many requests, they'll tell you, hey, slow down a little bit. But on my side, I don't have any of that. If I keep running that line, it's just gonna keep giving me back JSON hello world key. In this function, you can do a lot of things. So that result, if I just want a certain value, say these are high scores, and key 1 holds the current high score that somebody has. If I console.log result.key1, what that's saying is result is JSON object, and I'm going to get the value of the thing with key 1. It's a really long way to say it's giving whatever key 1 has a colon to. If I hit enter, it gives me back 5, because key 1 went to 5. So what's really happening here, remember I talked about JSON in the beginning as kind of a universal language that allows languages to communicate data between them. So why I can do this .key1 is because in JavaScript, this getJSON function knows it's getting back JSON from slash data. It's converting it for you into something called an associative array in JavaScript, which is the exact same thing basically as a dictionary in Python. So it's converting it into its own data type. You don't have to do anything with telling it to parse the data, it just knows. So just like in Python, we just have to return the dictionary with a little JSONify function, and it did that conversion for us. Likewise, JavaScript also does that conversion for us. Every language should have a very simple one-line function that converts a dictionary-like object to JSON, and also likewise from JSON back to a dictionary-like object. So from this, maybe if this page was high scores, I could have my data function just return more JSON that would have the names of everyone, what their scores are, and then in here I could have a little for loop that displays everyone's high score. I'll show that really quick. That'll probably be the last thing I do here before I take questions and maybe go into other stuff. But in app.py, maybe I change this so that every key is somebody's username and every value is a score that they had. So say user 3 had the high score, Pierce had -1. Now it's returning that data to the website. Now I can write, I'll actually write this in the, I'm going to change over, I'm going to write the JavaScript code in the HTML file instead of in the browser, just because it's going to be a couple of lines now. So I'll make a script tag, close the script tag, and I'm going to do the same things, $.get.json from slash data, send the result to a function that doesn't have a name. Now inside this function, I'm going to make a little for loop, and I'm going to say for, gosh, jQuery, I always forgot how to do this. It's star.each result function value. I'm not sure if that's correct. Does anybody know jQuery for loops, if that's right? No? Okay. jQuery is a terrible language. But it might actually have two values. Let me just console.log value. Let's see if that actually works. It's probably going to get mad at me here. Oh, it actually printed out. Hello, key 1, Pierce, and user 3. So it kind of did what I wanted. So for each result, I'm going to the body, add, I'm just going to add a little text that has the user's name, a colon, and then what their score is. So I'm going to say the document's body I'm going to append some HTML to it. This is all jQuery. You'll probably, or you most likely won't have to write jQuery very much ever again. I'm going to append a h3 with value. I'm going to close that h3. I'm going to open a paragraph, and I'm going to have what their score is plus result dot value. This code isn't, and I'm going to end it in HR. All that code is doing is it's adding HTML inside the body of our page. Remember, in HTML, the body is where anything you want to display goes. So I'm saying at the end of body, append an H3 with that value, so the person's name. Close the H3, open a paragraph. Inside the paragraph, put result.value. Result is the whole JSON tree. Value is the person's name, so that would be like result.pierce. And that would give you value -1, and I'm closing the paragraph, and an HR is just kind of a vertical bar that goes across the page. Reload the server, come back up here, hope everything works. Realt is not defined. Realt, result. I reload it, hope I don't get any JavaScript errors. I come to my page, and it says, hello is undefined, key1 is undefined, Pierce is undefined, user is undefined. So somewhere in there, I'm not getting the value from the JSON right. I don't think I'm going to try to do it. It'll probably take me a while to debug. But yeah, so key points on backends, things that will apply no matter what languages you guys are using. A server takes in a URL, gives back something, usually an HTML page, sometimes data. From any HTML page, you can use JavaScript and get the values from other servers. So from this HTML page, I'm requesting data from another endpoint, in this case /data. It could be from Facebook, it could be from anyone. And you can then take that data that it returns to you and display it on your page. So if you think of kind of any application on the planet, we started this morning, seniors did, Flask search. When you click search with certain categories, it sends what campus you searched for with what departments and what times and what all of those things you put into that form. Sends each of those as data to a URL. That URL is on a server, finds some function on Notre Dame's backend, which is written in Ruby on Rails. Their backend will say, hey, they asked for this category, whatever, yada yada, goes to their database, finds the classes that match all of those search parameters you typed in, and returns JSON with, here's a list of classes that user can take. Then in their front-end code, in their JavaScript, they say, hey, give me all of those classes in JSON, and then from that JSON, I'm going to dynamically add a bunch of rows to our page that have all of the classes that a user can take. And if too many people at one time, which always happens, go on to Flask Search or Novo and try to register at one time, the server is getting hit by too many requests, and just like my computer can't handle more than probably 100 people hitting it with requests at a time, every server has kind of a maximum number that it can be hit by. Notre Dame servers are no different. They're put on AWS. They try to have a lot of fancy things where if one server gets under too much pressure, it'll automatically create new servers for them with the same stuff. But in the end, it's always a really hard battle to make sure your website doesn't crash. AWS is Amazon Web Services. Amazon, the company that sells stuff, also has a big other half of their company, just like Google does and a lot of other places, that will host your websites for you. And yeah, that's most of what I have. I also might later go into deploying this website onto like Heroku, but not right now because that's more buggy. I might just show that to anyone who wants to stay. But any questions? That was a lot. That was a lot. Any questions or things you guys want me to go over on topics I didn't explain very clearly? Yeah.
So to do dynamic sites with Flask,
Yeah.
you'd have to write it in JavaScript and it would execute, or is there a way to do
So,
it dynamically?
so you could also do the templating. So from Flask, just like here, I use JavaScript to kind of dynamically add this to my site. I could also just do something like I could pass in the values from data and just do something that would end up looking like for like username score in like data, and then I would have some HTML in here, and then if I put inside of here, H3, yada, 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 and all that HTML, then when they loaded the page, it would just automatically be there. There's a couple of advantages and disadvantages to this. If you do it this way, it'll take a little bit longer for your page to initially load, because for your HTML to be sent to their browser, their server will have to manually go through your file and replace this with actual HTML code. In JavaScript, it will appear quicker, their site will appear quicker, and the values will appear kind of on the fly, so that's why there may be a little bit of lag between when you view the page and when the classes actually show up. But the page itself loads a little bit faster. But then the downside is this code is considerably easier to write for you, and it really doesn't add that much time. We're talking milliseconds. If your site's under a lot of pressure, it may add up. But for general use, this isn't very complex. Because if you think about it, this, if you have for loops and variables, it's the server that's responsible for generating the HTML and sending it back to the user. If you put JavaScript, it's the user's browser that runs the JavaScript. So their browser is the one that's under the pressure of getting this data and dynamically making the site. So it's a little bit easier on the server. It'll save you a couple bucks a month if you do it with JavaScript, but there's pros and cons to both.
Should we just give David, I think this is good when you go, so could we just give David a hand real quick? I know you get questions after.
So if we want to learn more about web development or want to like go over what you taught, where should we go?
Yeah, so Flask, that website, has a terrific thing. If you go /docs, Flask's documentation is terrific. If you want to continue on Flask, they have a full user guide where you can go through all these things. It'll go through virtual env, system-wide installation. It tells you what pip was, I never explained that. It goes through routing, static files, or those HTML files I showed you. This will go through everything in very clear detail with all of the code for how to use it. Also, if you want to go to anything else like Django, Book, each framework kind of has, if you just look up kind of on Stack Overflow or just look up like Django tutorials or Rails tutorials, you can find a lot of great things. The very last thing I'll say on that is on GitHub. If you search something and then the word awesome, you usually find amazing tutorials for that thing. So I don't know if Flask has one, but I'd assume it does. If I type Flask awesome, I get awesome Flask. So it's a huge list of here are a bunch of Flask tutorials, here are some courses on Flask, some books that are all free, some slides, videos, things that are built with Flask, different plugins for authentication, database stuff. Anything you type in plus awesome on GitHub will give you a terrific list of kind of next steps for learning about whatever part you want to learn about. Thanks for coming, guys.
Thank you.
Yeah.
If you're using CSS for formatting, do you have to do anything extra in Flask, or is that just link to that in the email?
Yeah, you